Hey guys, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the summer assignment this week, and then your assignment for this week will be a checkpoint on getting ready for the summer assignment. Normally I do this when we're all together closer to the end of the year, but I'm not 100% sure how everything's going to look, so I figure I would get the instructions out to you and get you started on it right now, just so that we have a little bit of head start on anything that happens or any changes that occur. So what you're going to be doing is something you probably already do already. Listen to a podcast. There's lots of podcasts out there. Why podcasts? Well, because podcasts are, filled with lots of really good information. There's a huge variety of topics. They can kind of be focused on stuff that already interests you. There are podcasts about everything from true crime and serial killers, which is I'm sure something you're at least a little bit familiar with because that's kind of the meat of the podcast market. But there's podcasts about technology, about science, about art, about history. There are podcasts about kind of just bizarre little random everyday events, and all of it's really good fodder for TOK themes about knowledge, how we gain it, how we use it. So that's why I like doing this project as a lead up to the summer, because you can use a lot of this information to help you write your essay and do your expo, which are the senior year TOK kind of summative assignments that the IB is going to grade you on. So just a little bit about, if you're unfamiliar with podcasts, you have a lot of options with this. The first checkpoint assignment is basically you'll have a week to kind of find something that seems to fit within the criteria of the project. There's two main types of podcasts out there. The first type is a serialized podcast. That's a podcast that tells one story. Usually it's organized into seasons. A lot of the true crime stuff was serialized. There's even a podcast called Serial that is a serialized telling of a true crime event. Each episode is going to fill in a little bit of the story. There'll be key themes and a narrative that are developed over the course of the whole season, with kind of a culmination in the last episode or so. So serialized podcasts are totally fair game. If you find something that you're really into that tells a really cool story, have at it. The second major type are what are called episodic podcasts. Those are podcasts that every episode is something new. So the podcast might have a theme like science or technology or just weird stuff, and every episode is going to go over something that those hosts are interested in and fits within the theme of the podcast. So episodic podcasts, there's no major overarching story that's being told. Every episode is self-contained. So you can kind of jump around. That they're not organized into seasons, and instead they're just kind of continuously putting out new, cool, interesting things. But each episode can stand on its own. So if you start listening to one episode, and you're like, this really isn't that interesting. Skip it. Do a different episode. As far as the actual assignment that you're going to do over the summer, the main part of it is the journal. You'll be completing a journal on a minimum of 10 entries. So if you pick a serialized podcast, if it's a little shorter than 10 episodes, maybe it's like an 8-episode series, that can still work. I might ask you to maybe complete a summary podcast of the actual narrative, and then like a reflective, not a summary podcast, but a summary of the overall podcast, and then maybe like a reflective journal over the entire thing. So you could still get to that 10 minimum entries. Those entries don't have to be super long. They can be typed or handwritten. It's your preference. Regardless of how you go about journaling, should be about 250 to 400 words, give or take, falling into that range somewhere. And that works out to, over the course of the summer, about one journal entry per week. Because the goal here isn't to give you a ton of summer work that drowns you. The idea is you could pace yourself or you could binge it. It's up to you. So things that I'm listening for when I listen to a podcast, what issues being discussed? What are the types of evidence being discussed? Is it all about empirical evidence, or is it more like reflective? Is it about eyewitness testimony? What's going on there? What are some clear areas of knowledge that this fits into. If you pick an episodic podcast, there's one called Stuff You Should Know. Literally, it's all over the place. So there might be, multiple areas of knowledge in a single episode, and you might cover dozens of areas of knowledge over the 10 you journal on. Pick a serialized one, the same areas of knowledge probably come up every single episode, and that's okay too. What ways of knowing are being discussed? What are they? How are they learning what they're learning throughout that podcast? What did you learn that you didn't already know? What was something new that was in that episode? Those are the things you should be including in your journal, and maybe it altered your perspective on something as a result. So just some suggestions. Some of these are getting kind of old. I might have to refresh my suggestions list. There's the original true crime podcast, Serial, which was about the conviction of Adnan Syed, who, the whole thing is basically was he really the person who should have been put on trial for the murder of Han Min Lee? So it's really interesting. It's like the OG podcast that kind of launched the whole thing. The Habitat's short. It was pretty cool. It's the audio journals of college students who volunteered to lock themselves in a geodesic dome on top of a volcano in Hawaii to simulate living on Mars for 1 year. So that one's pretty fun. You get a lot of the interesting personal stories of these people, why they chose to do it, what they learned about themselves. It's very introspective, but it's pretty interesting. There's a podcast called Dissect. It's all about music, and specifically they do albums, so they break down an album every season. It's pretty interesting. And then another one I mentioned already, Stuff You Should Know, which is kind of a, every week they put out an episode or two about interesting stuff. It's all over the place. Science, history, true crime, technology, cooking, anthropology. They really cover literally anything and everything. It's very interesting. The hosts are very laid back. It's a combination of both very interesting and nicely calming. So that's something you could maybe take a look at too. And there's a whole genre of podcasts that's kind of in that vein of random interesting stuff weekly. So if any of those pique your interest, you're free to use those. Obviously, there are tens of thousands of podcasts covering hundreds of thousands of topics. So your first assignment I'm going to post along with this video is that you're just going to have to find a podcast, and then you'll post the podcast that you're thinking about doing to the assignment.